So good afternoon, everyone. We are in for a treat this afternoon. And I know Professor Lucan Way and Professor Timothy Snyder have already had a long day. Some of you have had one as well. So we're going to do this in an informal way. First of all, we're going to skip the formal introductions. Anybody who doesn't know Lucan Way and
Screw
Timothy,
you.
and Timothy Snyder, I don't know where you've been, all right? We are going to talk broadly about authoritarian tendencies in contemporary U.S. politics. How Lucan and Tim see where we are, where along the trajectory we are, and why they think we are where we are, and then where they think the United States is going. After this historic month, that's where it's going. After this historic month in the United States, I'm going to start first with Lucan, who just has an article published in Foreign Affairs with Steve Levitsky. If you haven't read it, because I see many students in the room, make a little note to yourself to go read it, okay? Lucan, as Timothy just said, air your argument so that we can riff on it.
Sure. So when Trump was reelected, I was struck, my co-author and I, by the kind of complacency that I met with a lot of smart people. I remember I was actually at the Royal Society and talking to like the smartest people in Canada. And they were saying, well, Trump's first term wasn't that bad, so what are we really worrying about? Everybody's, Tim Snyder said it was going to be fascism. So far there isn't fascism, whatever. But, and so the point is, so I'm less Canadian than you think.
Is that in the protocol? The Royal Society says, Tim Snyder says.
Anyways, and I just felt that was deeply misguided. And I felt that we were really very much we being the United States, on the cusp of authoritarianism, and that the complacency rooted in the first term was deeply mistaken, because when Trump came in 2016, he had no team, he had no plan, and he didn't, control any the Republican Party. As a result, much of the first term was actually controlled by small d Democrats in the Republican Party, and his various attempts, mostly half-hearted, to sort of prosecute John Kerry and others failed. But this 2024, it's obvious, was quite different. He had 8 years to establish firm control over the Republican Party. They were very much locked in step. The Republican Party had firmly gone to the side of authoritarianism. There's nothing more authoritarian than willing to support the armed overthrow of free and fair elections in January 6th. And so we basically felt that it was on the cusp of competitive authoritarianism. And in this article, we lay out the concept of competitive authoritarianism, which we argue is more likely than sort of, this is where, perhaps we'll have a dialogue here, than sort of fascism or single party rule, but as a form of authoritarianism in which elections still matter, they still occur regularly, opposition operates openly, but in which there are all sorts of authoritarian abuse. It's basically, like a soccer match in which the referees favor one side over the other. So you still have the soccer match, you still have competing sides, but you have incredibly biased referees. And I think then we talk about sort of the ways in which this will manifest itself. And I wanted to make the case that, against complacency, that this is really going to fundamentally alter American political life. So until now, until about a month ago, for the last 100 years, opposition has been fairly costless. We've supported one party or the other, but we never have to worry about getting punished or, by the government for this action. That is no longer the case. We are entering an era in which if you give to the Democratic Party, you are very likely to expect, audits by the IRS. If you are a business person who makes the mistake of having Democratic donors on your board, or people who are not vehemently pro-Trump, you will lose business opportunities. And so the costs of opposition will increase significantly. And so far, I am sad to say, if anything, our article was kind of overly optimistic.
Timothy.
Okay, so I guess the way we're going to do this is to have a kind of back and forth where Janet's going to rev herself up to Janet's going to rev herself up to ask us some questions.
It won't take long.
Yeah, no, I'm not worried. So I'm going to have just a couple of points in response to that. The first is that I think that Lucan is absolutely right to think that we're in the midst of something that would be best categorized as a regime change. And then, if we agree on that, then the live question is, what sort of regime change is it going to be? And here there are a couple of levels of analysis. One would be, what are the things that have already happened, including pre-2025? And the second level of analysis is the relationship between what they're going for and what they're going to get. So to preview where I'm going to end up, I think if Lucan is right, it's not because that's what they're going for. It may be that that's what they're going to get at the end, but I don't think it's what they're going for. I think they're going for something else. I think they're going for something which is much more like right-wing anarchism or fascism. So the things that are already out there in the world, which look fascist to me, would be, for example, the cult of the leader, which we definitely have. I'm coming back from 3.5 weeks in Europe where there were places where I didn't have to listen to Americans and places where I did have to listen to Americans. Davos at the beginning, I had to listen to Americans. The Munich Security Conference at the end, I had to listen to Americans. And then there was a blessed 3 weeks in the middle where I didn't have to listen to Americans. But when I had to listen to American officials, I found that my mind was doing this trick where every time an American official said Donald Trump, my mind changed it to Mighty Lenin. And I found that if you listen to them that way, like if you just change Donald Trump to Mighty Lenin, it makes a lot more sense, right? That it's a person who's beyond space and time, and they're constantly suggesting that he can do all kinds of things that other people can't do. This came up again and again with respect to Ukraine, when someone would point out some obvious contradiction. So, Donald Trump has already given away the top 9 Russian negotiating points, but you don't understand that he's, a negotiator like no other negotiator. So that he's being held, like everything he does is somehow magical, and you can't hold him to normal standards. And even the apparent facts aren't really facts because his character somehow is 4-dimensional or 5-dimensional. Another thing which is fascist that I think we definitely have is conspiracy theorizing.
Yeah.
So the whole business of the deep state is a bottomless conspiracy theory. And no matter how many layers you pull off, there's always going to be one more layer of the deep state down there somewhere. So even if they bring in their own people and put them in the top and they fire the top civil servants and they keep going at it, they're still going to keep talking about the deep state. And there are other more wild conspiracy theories that are out there as well, functioning at the same time. A third thing which is a bit fascist is the one-party state, which we're not quite there yet, but the idea that only Republicans can rule and that everybody else is the enemy is pretty well advanced at this point. And what Lucan is describing as the uneven playing field can also be described as preparatory to a one-party state. And I would note that a lot of Americans are used to one-party state rule because of our federal system, in which it's de facto impossible now for the Democrats to win elections in a number of our federal states. Another thing which is, I think we already have and which has a pretty long trajectory at this point, which is fascist, is a big lie. So not just a falsehood, not just a kind of the ordinary political, being economical with the actualité, as I once heard a British politician express it, but rather saying something which is not true and which is so big that it has to draw people into a different reality. And there are a number of big lies or medium-sized lies, but the biggest one, the most operational one, is the idea that Trump won the election in 2020, which you have to now believe if you're going to serve in the FBI, or you have to claim to believe it.
Yeah.
And this business of having to claim to believe things that sort of everyone knows are false, and this like distinction between the people who are true believers in the lie and the people who are pretending to believe in the lie, and that becoming the relevant distinction, that is very redolent of 20th century totalitarianism, in my view. Now, I'm gonna take just a couple of critical angles on this as well, or things that one could think about. The wealth is different. Our leading fascists now tend to be extremely wealthy, which whatever one wants to say about fascism in the 1920s and 30s was not true. They were not in it for the money, those fascists. And there's a funny way, I think, in which the Marxists of the 1920s and 30s were right. They were just 100 years early in their analysis of fascism. Like there's a funny way in which our weirdo capitalists are in fact fascists, which people were saying in the 1920s and 30s, but which wasn't actually right. Another point one might want to make coming in it more critically would be that these people are very old. Fascism used to be more of a cult of physical fitness and youth than it is now. And one of the striking things about January 6th, I'm agreeing, of course, with Lucan that that's a turning point. That was an attempt to overthrow a rule of law state with violence. But one of the reasons it failed was that the typical middle-aged American male is not in very good physical shape. If those guys had been younger and more fit, they would have caught Mike Pence, right? No, seriously, it was a matter of literally minutes. If they'd been younger and more fit, they would have caught a bunch of those senators, and it would have been a very different story. So that's sort of a joke, but it's also a suggestion of how things are a little bit different. And then where I want to land this is that they're going for something now. And when I read Lucan's article, which I did once or twice before he published it, one of the thing I tried to get him to say, which I'm not sure he ended up saying, is the name Elon Musk. Because I think Musk is going for a kind of right-wing anarchism in which the state is dysfunctional. And that's a big aspiration. It's a big aspiration, and it's going to have consequences. It may be that when all the pieces fall down, we will be in a kind of competitive authoritarian position. It may be that when all the pieces fall down, Canada's going to have a couple more provinces. It's an aspiration which is so ambitious that I think the consequences of it are pretty unpredictable, right? It may succeed. They may end up in a situation where I think they want to be, which is that nobody expects anything from government, and politics is all about us and them. And they get to rule sort of in the chaos, which I would see as a variety of fascism. So
let me pick up on two big points that Tim just put on the table for us, Lucan. One is the deep state argument. Right? The deep state argument has two versions. If you look around at authoritarian politics, the deep state works to sustain authoritarianism. That's one view of it. But that's not what's happening here. These authoritarians are going after the state to destroy it. So how does that fit? Let's talk about that first, and then let's talk about let's come back.
I have a number of responses.
Okay, go.
I think you're absolutely right, Janice, that the deep state is really kind of central. We actually don't mention the word deep state in the article, but it's really central to our argument, which is basically that I think what a lot of social scientists missed, and I certainly among them, if you look at the literature on democracy, there's almost no literature on this, which is that core to the resilience of democracy is not just economic development, it's not just the middle class. It's also the fact that the state operates at an arm's length from the government. The state in the modern world is incredibly powerful, right? I mean, if you look at the trajectory since the 1800s, when we had the spoils system in the United States, the state is vastly more powerful in its ability to regulate the economy and its ability to generate wealth. It's simply much wealthier. In principle, if one controls the state and you're able to use it for partisan ends, you could truly create a totalitarian fascist state. So in a sense, the boring civil servants, the guys who everyone loves to hate, the gray bureaucrats, they are the heroes. They are the people on the front lines protecting democracy everywhere. So the next time you go into the DMV, just give them a little thanks. I'm not kidding, right? And
is it called the DMV up here?
yeah, I was like, is it? Service on, okay, sorry. See, I'm American, what can I say? You revealed me. You weren't supposed to say anything. Yeah, anyways, yeah, Service Canada, right?
Ontario.
Service Ontario, okay. I'm such a bad Canadian man. You know, and I think the deep set is all about discrediting, you know, that because they realize in the 21st century that that is the biggest impediment to getting what they want, right? And so we've seen this again and again in Turkey, in Hungary, in Poland until 2023. You know, when dictators come to power in the 21st century, they start by purging the state. This is very different, I think, from, I mean, you know, from earlier eras, right? And so I think that's absolutely right, and I think that's, you know, that's really key to understanding what's going on. So I mean, it is a conspiracy theory, and there are elements of that, but it's also very instrumental, right? You know, it's a very instrumental way of thought.
So just on that, before we move on, what do you make of the pushback this last weekend that came in red states when Congress people went home for the weekend, and the pushback was exactly on this issue, on the attack on the state and the attack on the bureaucracy, and I'm not going to get my benefits if you keep this up, so you quit. And it came very strongly in red states.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've written about this on Twitter, Tim, and I think, you know, I think we are, I mean, we're already kind of jumping ahead, but I think we're potentially kind of in a optimistic moment where we could, you know, be witnessing the breakdown. I mean, it's really hard to know in real time what's going on. So that I mean, we could just, you know, this could be one hiccup along the lines, but there are sort of a number of signs of resistance, right, that we've seen. I think, you know, the federal bureaucrats are now, you know, getting a bit of stomach to sort of resist. We've had several efforts to sort of say that we're not going to just fire all probationary employees, about 200,000 employees. And, you know, there have been a number of suits. There are signs of splits within the Musk-Trump coalition. You know, that Musk sort of famously said to everyone to sort of, you know, tell me what you've done productively in the last week. You know, RFK, Tulsi Gabbard, all those people have said, no, don't do that. That clearly is a split. You know, 41 DOJ employees resigned. You also, again, see these, you know, it's been remarkable, you know, watching these videos. I highly recommend everyone do it, of these town halls, because the anger, I mean, it's like the Tea Party, but it, you know, the good guys. Right? It's in reverse. It is really remarkable. And I think
it is.
I mean, I think the Democrats.
You don't see that in Orban's Hungary.
No.
No.
Yeah. No, that's right.
Tim, what do you think?
I want to pause on Lucan's point about the civil servants, not because I want to like drop phrases like Service Ontario or Canada Tire, which seems to be where Canadian Tire, which seems to be where Service Ontario is located, at least in my limited experience. But I want to take that point, and I want to just keep going with it. It's something that I became very sensitive to as a historian of the Holocaust, because it turns out, and this is in Raoul Hilberg's book, like pretty much every argument ever made about the Holocaust is in Raoul Hilberg's original history from 1962. But it turns out that the best predictor of how many Jews are killed in a given country is not how anti-Semitic you think it is or how anti-Semitic it actually was. The best predictor of what happens is the degree to which the pre-war state is destroyed. In my book, Black Earth, I spent a fair amount of time weighing this, mulling this, quantifying it as best I could. And this is a striking conclusion to which I came. That there's a chapter in that book called The Gray Saviors, which is about this. Because we want, again, I'm making Lucan's point in a slightly heavier way. We want the heroes to be people who stand out and are exceptional and are beyond the institutions somehow. But in fact, the thing which slowed it down was precisely the bureaucracy in a lot of different ways. And I can give you some striking instances of this, like, for example, the Holocaust in France. The main victim of the Holocaust in France was not the French Jews. The main victim of the Holocaust in France were Polish Jews, even though, of course, there were far more French Jews. But the reason was that Polish Jews were regarded as not having a state affiliation. And since they were stateless, there was no bureaucracy, there was nothing to slow it down. And in order for Vichy to kill French Jews, they had to first go through a pretty onerous process of depatriating them. And this kind of anecdote you can repeat over and over and over again. And it always points to the same conclusion, that it's this state and the person's attachment to the state that slows it down. Even if you look at it from the most glamorous side, which is rescue, all of the big rescuers, all the people who rescued large numbers of Jews had some kind of connection with the state. Most of them were diplomats. And the way they saved people was by precisely extending state protection in a slightly unorthodox and creative way. Right. So a Japanese consul in Lithuania, a Chinese consul in Vienna, it's always the same story. American diplomats in Iberia, it's always the same story. And so given the significance of the Holocaust as history, but also as a point of political reference, I think this is a very important point, and it should be a more prestige-laden point than it is, that the resistance to the terrible things often involves a functioning bureaucracy. So I wanted to come down on that point very hard before we did anything else.
I think it's a profoundly important point. I mean, it's a profoundly important point that Tim is making, and we don't pay enough attention to, because it's all too easy to attach bureaucracy and to prevent frustration in democratic societies. You know, I think about the deep state, for example, in Egypt. It was the presence of the deep state that actually constrained the Egyptian military from firing on the Egyptian population when it took to the streets, unlike other military. So in this sense, it's counterintuitive. And it's also very, very important that we saw in the policy is that is actually citizens defending what the three of us would call the deep state.
Well,
right?
I wouldn't call it the deep state.
You know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But I guess I want to sort of have a little bit more pessimism, going there. A couple of things. One, I mean, it's the deep state is a well-chosen target. People, may like their Medicaid checks, but people are never going to rise up for employment protections. I mean, I know as a scholar that employment protections are central to the survival of democracy, but that is not an issue the Democratic Party should take up. Let's have more tenure. I mean, my God, yeah, right. It's the worst politician in the world would do that. And also, you look at the people, the brave bureaucrats, Sassoon, who in the Southern District of New York, who resigned. So, that is amazing that she did that. But the vast majority of people just cannot do that. They have mortgages, they have children they need to feed. I suspect, that Sassoon and the people who do it have independent sources of wealth, because that allows them, it's just very hard. You cannot expect people to do that, and I think the heroes, I feel like that's why I feel like in the sense, the deck is stacked in Trump's favor, because ultimately, especially now, like people are being fired en masse. So if there was any time that you should not resign, it's now, because there are simply no jobs, right? I mean, if you resigned 2 years ago, but now everybody's looking for a job. So I just feel ultimately, I just don't know how long this resistance is gonna.
Okay,
just tell us also why you said, no, I would not call this the deep state.
Oh, well, no, just because it's a conspiratorial term. That's all. But can I follow up on Lucan? Because I share your concern, but when we're trying to diagnose what's going to happen, I think there is a tension between two things that they're trying to do at the same time. And I think there are different people who are trying to do slightly different things, and that this contradiction hasn't yet emerged in full force. One thing they're trying to do is to tame the bureaucracy so that it does the things they want it to do. And that's more Office of Management budget. But another thing they're trying to do is just destroy the bureaucracy so it can't do anything at all. And that's more Musk and Dodge, however you say it, it should be pronounced Dodgy in my view. I think we should I think we should enforce
I'm gonna
that.
go with Dodgy.
But those two things are actually contradictory, and neither of them is that easy. So while I agree that the image of a bureaucracy standing its ground is not plausible, I also think that both of those projects, like the right-wing anarchist project and the Musk project and the authoritarian, managed authoritarian project, they're both hard, and they're in contradiction with each other. And I don't think a month in, the contradictions are starting to emerge, right?
Let's talk for a second about the Elon Musk project, which we can describe as destroy the bureaucracy. And so there's another tradition, as you know, in international political economy, which probably better captures the way Elon Musk thinks, because he doesn't know enough politics to think the way you and Timothy just described it. He's in the creative destruction, Joseph Schumpeterian tradition. You destroy and then you wait to see what comes up from the ashes, because that's how you regenerate and build new. The reason I bring that up is it's not clear that it's destroy the bureaucracy as a long-term goal. It's something else for him, I think.
Well, I think it's destroy the state. I mean, I think destroying the bureaucracy is just the beginning. I think his basic idea is that there ought to be competition. There ought to be competition among races, and like the superior people will rise to the top. And the fact that he's at the top means that the superior races do rise to the top. I mean, I think he's both a fascist and a centibillionaire who has the ability to support other fascists, and those two things are happening at the same time. I don't think destroy the bureaucracy is the end goal. I think destroying the rule of law is the end goal, and having a political formation which is just there to make life easier for certain oligarchs.
Okay, let me push the two of you on this, because fascists need states. They do. The fascist project has always needed an executive arm, right, to move forward and implement the fascist project. And so that's why I'm not wholly persuaded that this is Musk's project. I think it's far more consistent with a culture in Silicon Valley, which is break it all so that we will get the next generation and we won't be encumbered by a lumbering, creaky thing that's not fit for purpose anymore. But that doesn't preclude standing up.
So I think
something new for him. I'm just not sure. That's all.
So I think, I think since I think we talked about having this debate on fascism a month, I have sort of more come to your side, Tim, and it's really hard to ignore, the kind of the similarities in terms of, the focus on resentment, violence, the big lie, I mean, all these things. But I see it more as an impulse, like a fascist impulse, which is definitely there. And whereas what I'm describing in my piece is more about the institutions or regime type. So it's certainly not fascism as a regime type, and I think that's very unlikely. I mean, anything is possible, right? But I think that, and I guess I worry, and I was talking to some journalists about this, that I feel like people, it's important to understand what terms mean for most people, right? And I think for most people, fascism means death camps. And I worry that, in a sense, when that doesn't happen, people dismiss the threat of Trump. So that's, I guess, my concern about the use of the term.
So how would you respond?
Yeah, I mean, we promised not to have an uptight discussion about whether we're allowed to use the word. I feel like you've broken a promise.
Yeah.
No, so here's how I feel about that. I feel like I feel like we tied our hands as academics about a decade ago with that claim that we need to think about the social consequences of our analytical categories and make decisions about scholarly practice based upon our own assessments of the social consequences of our analytical categories. And I think that we're shite at knowing the social consequences of our analytical categories. And therefore, we should just stick with the analytical categories that we think actually describe the world. That's how I feel about it.
Yeah.
I don't know if you say shite in Canada or not. I
We
never
do.
I
We
never
do.
know whether it's like a
We
more
do.
British thing. Okay, all right. So
We do.
I get points for that, right? Like
Yes.
I get those back that I got wrong with the tire. Okay.
Yeah.
So my view on this is that we should, if we think it's fascism, we should use the word and not worry about the consequences,
fair
because
enough.
I don't think we can actually predict them. And I actually think so I think there's a phenomenon of fascism. Like I see it I see it as a phenomenon. And so it can be an impulse, it can be a set of practices, it can be an ideology, whatever. But I think it's a phenomenon that, is in the world, that's as real in the world as other phenomena. It's as real as liberalism, for example. It's as real as other phenomena. And so therefore I think it's applicable. And with respect to Musk, I mean, like insofar as impulse is the word we leap to, I think that is itself a fascist thing, like the notion that impulse is what politics is all about. And Janice, I think there is a libertarianism to fascism conveyor belt. And I don't think this notion of creative destruction is, as innocently Schumpeterian as you're making it out to be. I think part of it is frankly social Darwinistic, that you need to destroy all of these things that have propped up the losers so that the winners can rise to the top, right? And I think also the libertarian business of destroying the state is a not particularly well camouflaged version of the politics of us and them. And it's very easily, and I think we have seen it happen, that the people who one day say the only problem is the government, they shift very quickly to saying the only problem is the government allows all these unpleasant people into the country. And then the next day they say the only problem is all these unpleasant people who are in the country. And so you go very, like, so long as you start talking about, this is my own personal, obsession, but when you start talking about freedom negatively as us against the government, and you define success as being against the government, before long you end up in this politics where it's just you and them, and the government doesn't matter, it's dysfunctional, and it's just about like a spectacle of Americans fighting other Americans. So I hope you're right, Lucan, that like it's not very likely that we're gonna get there, but there is a funny mix of people we have in the American government right now, which range from these kind of libertarian fascists all the way down to the Christian national sort of fascists, and they do seem to be in power at the moment. Right.
To lend support to what you just argued, Tim, right? If you look at what Elon Musk did with the AfD in Germany, that's really hard to reconcile with Schumpeterian creative destruction.
Yeah.
It doesn't really fit together. And so that's where I think Tim is right. But it's a unique combination of a culture that comes out of a deeply technological culture in the United States, which I've seen up close and isn't accompanied with fascist tendencies. But in this case, this combination is really worrying. And, Lucan, go further. Why aren't death camps a requirement of fascism?
No, I wasn't saying there was a requirement. That was.
Leave aside the social.
No, I'm just saying that as a
argument. I don't see why that is.
I mean, I agree with you that you ultimately also, first of all, we're bad political strategists. I mean, if we try to sort of predict how terms will be used. We won't. Nonetheless, it is just, I think, probably objectively the case that, people miss, that term, I'm just saying that that's, potentially the impact of the term. And so, so I'm not saying you should not use it, and you should certainly use, the term that you think applies. I mean, I actually just don't think that the chances of a fascist regime is very likely.
So talk about that. Why not?
Well, I mean, I think, I think it's, to bring up a little bit of optimism to I think that, this is, United States, as bad as things are, there are a number of sources of resilience for democracy. I think we have, a well-developed capitalist economy. I mean, that you have a few of these oligarchs, Bezos, Musk, and Zuckerberg, but you also have a vast range of smaller businesses in whose interest this is, who are very powerful, very large part of the economy, and it's definitely not in their interest to have kind of Musk-style fascism. And you have, a middle class that has resources that can give to civil society, and it's just very hard, in these wealthy societies for any party to monopolize political control. So right now, if you look at, granted, this is right now, this is, not clowning what's going on in the States, fully 95% of high-income countries that are non-petro states are democratic. That's virtually all of them. So it suggests that, correlation is not causation, but 95%. And, there is this major outlier, which we're focusing on right now, rightly so. But it is also important to remember, that there is, and so I don't know what to do with this. In fact, I'm thinking of writing a book on it, right? Like, that it is striking to me that you have, what's remarkable about the United States is this combination of some clear movement towards authoritarianism, but with a political economy that for very good theoretical and empirical reasons tells you there should not be authoritarianism. So, so I mix the two and I get, hybrid rule.
So Tim, where do you disagree?
So I just want to point out there are two distinct questions. The one is it fascism? And the other is, does it win? Right. So it can be fascism but not win, or as I believe, it can be fascism and it will end up in some kind of mixture. Right. Yeah. So I just want to make that point because I'm not trying to claim that we're going to end up in a perfectly fascist regime, whatever that might mean. I'm going for it's fascism. Yeah, but you're right. I'm closer to that than you are. And let me just, for the sake of contrast, make some contrary points. The wealth argument I'm suspicious about because there's a long tradition of pointing out, going all the way back to the Greeks, that it's not the amount of wealth, it's the distribution of wealth. And if you cut off Musk, Bezos, and the next 18 people after that, suddenly we only have half as much wealth as we did before. And I would argue, or maybe it's not 18, maybe it's 48, but it's irrelevant. Maybe it's 400. It doesn't matter. You can take a group of people who would fit in this building, you take them out of the equation, and it turns out the United States is not a wealthy country anymore, right? Because they are pulling the average up. And all this stuff is based on averages, and averages don't mean anything.
But Tim, come on, you still have, just look around you, there's inequality, but you have like an extensive middle class. That is simply objectively the case. I know you have inequality, but I guess it's relative. I study cases like Burundi, and it's all kind of relative. So I think compared to other places, middle income countries, the United States is just vastly wealthier, and the resources are vastly more distributed, even with the inequality, right? So I just find it. How can you imagine, anyone seizing control of that? Even Trump.
So let's ask the question: how effective do you think, Tim, more distributed economy? Let's not argue about the empirics of this, but theoretically, how effective is a more distributed economy in constraining fascism?
Well, I think partly it has to do with people's perceived horizons of possibility. Yeah. So I'm also suspicious. I have like direct answers to this, which is that I think a lot of the middle class has in some way been oligarchized, and that the classical argument about inequality has to do with the claim that the people who are very wealthy end up being poles of attraction for the people who are less wealthy. So like the case of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which is a classical example of a republic that falls, is that you have a few people who are and the equivalent of the middle class, but it's basically been co-opted. It's dependent upon a few, and so you look at it and it's a republican principle, but in fact, there are a few poles of actual power. And I think we're closer to that than we think. And also, just the healthcare sector of our economy, which is like 20%, like that should not be counted positively. That should be counted negatively. Like I don't. That's not. And if you start to play a few tricks like this, the American economy just doesn't look as big. But the different point I want to make is that I think a middle class only exists in the fourth dimension. Like it only exists when people see themselves as moving forward into something better, and that this is the problem in the US. And I think it is the characteristic feature of a lot of Trump's electorate. You might say, well, these guys are making, $85,000 a year, and last year they had a vacation in Italy or whatever, but they're not doing better than their parents. And they don't think and the next generations don't think they're going to do better than their parents. And I think that activates something. I think that leads to a shift where you believe, instead of believing that all boats are rising on this rising tide, you think, I have to be a pirate.
Yeah.
Right. The only way to do it is to be a pirate. And so therefore a hustler like Trump or a hustler like Musk becomes the ideal political figure. Not the self-made man, because they're not self-made men, but the person who got lucky, who inherited money and then cheated and then lied and then committed some crimes, and had a bunch of kids with a bunch of women. That person becomes the ideal. No, that's true,
yeah.
Right? Except Trump doesn't have a bunch of money, or he didn't until the meme coin. And I think that was his breakthrough. But which proves the point. Like it's all a hustle, right?
Yeah.
And so I think you reach a subjective point where people they start thinking in terms of hero worship, and the hero worshiper, the hero they're worshiping is a kind of hustler. And that has to do, but that has to do directly with the social welfare state and the lack of a sense of progress.
Okay, so let me ask one question, because what Tim's argument seems to say, and correct me, Tim, jump right back in, is a sense of pessimism about the future. Because if you believe your children are not going to do as well as you, and they're not going to have the same quality of life, this is a deeply pessimistic view of the future. And those are, by the way, Trump voters. That's what we know from the polling. The Trump voters are overwhelmingly people who believe that their children are not going to have the opportunities that they've had. Is that a precursor from fascism?
This is what I think. I agree with you that, certainly the fact that you're well off does not preclude you from being resentful. And for, that you're obviously absolutely right. No, in that sense, I completely agree with you. I guess where we differ, and I guess I'm sort of asking a somewhat different question. You're sort of asking, why are people supporting Trump, and these awful hucksters? And it's just like a really important question. So I'm asking a slightly different question, which is practically, I'm sort of looking into the future. Will Josh Shapiro or whoever, Chris Murphy or whatever sort of emerges as a Democratic, standard bearer, will there be enough wealth out there that he'll be able to attract significant amounts of support to mount a serious challenge? Now, I find it utterly implausible that this will not be the case. Because ultimately, to impose fascism and to impose Putin-style rule, and I agree that's pretty fascist, you need to basically squeeze that source of wealth, as Putin did in the early 2000s, long before. And I find that, implausible. The second point I want to make is that resentment that has been driving populism and support for Trump, well, guess what? Trump's now the incumbent. And it's not, there's definitely more than a non-zero chance that some of this anger will sort of suddenly actually go in an anti-fascist direction, sort of undermine fascism. So, I think one of the interesting things that we've seen, everybody kind of interpreted the 2024 election as like, what does this tell about us in America? But in fact, since 2020, close to 80% of incumbents in democracies have lost. People are just really angry everywhere. And we don't really know why. And I think the anger is, you're absolutely right. That's what's driving the support for Trump and the kind of fascism. But I do think that it can rebound in ways that sort of undermine authoritarianism.
Tim?
Yeah, I'm sort of thinking I should stop making that point about January 6th and physical fitness. That's what I'm thinking about right now. Because they're going to, this is being recorded and they're going to watch it and they're all going to start you know, they're going to start.
Don't worry, Trump will never get.
They're going to start doing intervals, and that's, so yeah. So like in a way, we're talking about two different things. We're talking about like, can they bring about a textbook fascist outcome, and are they fascists, or are some of them fascists, or do they have fascist schools, and are there fascists in America? And that's the point I wanted to pause on, because when you mentioned the should we use the word or not debate, which is of course something that academics much prefer to talk about than the actual phenomenon, and I tried really, really hard to stay out of that.
Policing terms is so fun.
Yeah, exactly. And so I tried really hard to stay out of that, but I've been dragged into it a couple of times against my will. And there was an article in the Times about this in like say September or October, a few weeks before the election, into which I got dragged. And they asked Paxton, who, as you may know, is a very distinguished historian of Vichy France and wrote an important book about fascism. And Paxton Robert Paxton is a sort of, he was appealed to as an authority. And Paxton said, what I thought was an interesting thing. He said, well, like a lot of people, I kind of agree with everybody. Like on the one hand, it's probably fascism. On the other hand, I agree with the people who say it's not so useful to use the term, because when you use it, it just leads to all these unpredictable consequences. But by the way, the most important thing, says Paxton, is that if you compare the US and Germany and Italy, like it's not so much the ideologies of the leaders that's so interesting. What's more interesting is that fascism has more of a social basis in the United States than it did in Germany or Italy in the 20s and 30s. And that's a point, like, let's assume that for a moment that Professor Paxton is right. That seems like a point which is worth resting on, that there may actually be more support for that kind of order in 2025 in the US than there was in 1933 in Germany. And if that's true, it would then become less of a political trick to bring a fascist order about. That's my first point, that like it may be that actually the population is more fascist than the population of Italy or Germany was. But on the other side, and here I'm going to partially agree with Lucan, it's the United States. The wealth doesn't faze me so much because I think it's unequally distributed, and I think people are really angry about the unequal distribution. And the wealth also doesn't faze me so much because of the way that race plays into this. And we can't talk about American fascism without talking about American slavery, because the way that fascism works in the US, in my view, I'm an American and I'm a historian, but I'm not an American historian. But the way that it works, in my view, is that we have deep down this idea that white people can be free because white people control other people, and that's our notion of freedom. And that is deeply connected with our idea of negative freedom, because our view is that the government is the only force which can stop white people from dominating other people, right? So that's another way that the libertarianism to fascism transmission belt works, is that it's based on a starting point where certain white people are dominant. That's a natural state of things, and only the government can break that, as it did by winning the Civil War, as it did by enfranchising African Americans in the 60s and 70s and so on, right? And so those things are deeply connected. And the resentment that people feel, or that many people in the US feel, is very racially inflected, because it's not just objectively, I'm not going to be better than my parents. It's also, somebody told me that the reason I'm not going to be better than my parents is the immigrants, or the Black people, or the trans people,
or the Jews,
or all of them at the same time, right? Like I know in October, I spent October in the American Midwest, and so naturally I watched a lot of football on television, as one does. And the Trump ads were basically, there is a Jewish conspiracy to get Kamala Harris into power so she can bring all the Mexicans over the border and personally give them sex change operations, after which they will take your jobs, right?
Yeah,
like that
right.
was, that was basically it. But it's playing, but it's playing on American history, right? It's playing on it's playing on the deepest divide, in my view, which is the white-black divide. And that changes the way a little bit that all this inequality stuff works, or all the social mobility stuff works, because the moment that white people, with apologies to all of you nice white people out there, the moment that white people feel like they're blocked, they think it may have to do with, not with themselves, because we are, of course, destined, right, to be, joined to like look at the affirmative action that the Trump administration is carrying out for underqualified white men,
Yeah.
right? Like it's extraordinary, but somehow underqualified white men never say, and again, apologies to all of you underqualified white men out there who do this, I'd be happy to meet you. But in general, underqualified white men never say, oh, I'm an underqualified white man. That's a sentence which never comes out of anybody's mouth in American English for some reason. So anyway, the point is that this is a way, I think, in which it is a little bit fascist. That the resentment tracks to a history of racial discrimination.
Yeah. So I think that's a really important point, because I was going to go to the question exactly. I think you've answered it, Tim. Why does Robert Paxton make this claim, right? What is it about America where he makes this claim that the social support for fascism is so much greater? Because in Canada, by the way, we have exactly the same issue, that people are pessimistic about the future, a chunk, and believe that their kids will not have as good a lifestyle as they are, but they're not the same fascist tendencies. So what is it about the United States that makes a difference? I think Tim's absolutely right, Lucan, that it's because it's an intersection with race here.
Absolutely.
Which is just not there in other teetering democracies. And you see in Elon Musk, I mean, it's open, frankly.
Yeah, without doubt. I mean, although I think, it is true that the flip side of the purely kind of racial argument was that at least I think some of us felt a kind of optimism, because ultimately the non-whites were sort of getting more. But I think what's in a sense more disturbing about the 2024 election is that it's actually less about race and more about traditional values, which can appeal both to whites, but also to sort of an American, Hispanics and African American men. So in fact, I think it's interesting, because at one level, the fact that it's racial, makes it existential, which kind of creates a sense of stakes and sort of makes sort of a kind of fascism very plausible. At the other hand, that kind of means that the support base is because they aren't exercising, right? They're not going to follow your advice. They're going to die off. But in fact, what's most disturbing to me is that they've actually managed to adapt and attract these people that we didn't think they would be able to attract.
Okay, we're going to go to the audience. So last question to you, then get your questions ready, okay? I'm going to ask you both 1 minute answer. Where are we by September 2025, 2026? A year and a half out.
So I'm going to make an optimistic prediction. I think we're sort of closer. I mean, I think for me, optimism is constitutional crisis and instability. Pessimism is, Republican monopoly. So I think, people will say, oh my God, there's going to be a constitutional crisis. I'm like, please, that is like the best outcome. Right. So I'm going to say crisis.
Tim, where are we a year and a half from now?
So I'm glad you asked, because this is something that I've been meaning to say the whole time, which I never quite got around to. At the beginning, I said, okay, they're aiming for fascism, but they might well end up in the sort of place that Lucan is describing. But they might also end up in other places. My strongest intuition about all of this is that because they're going for so much, they're going to generate an unpredictable range of counterforces, both inside and outside the regime, and that those things are going to bounce around against each other in ways that are, and I don't mean to dodge the question, I'm going to try to put this in a precise way, but they're going to bounce around against each other in such a way that in the middle of 2026, stuff will have happened that we will have trouble imagining. Some of it positive, some of it negative. And my own, I knock on wood and I don't want to see it. And I can find the thought very sad. But one place where I am, which not very many of my fellow Americans are, is that I'm concerned about the stability of the union. Because I don't, in many of these variants, I don't see why people would pay taxes. And the taxes are, of course, what holds the union together. The blue states pay them and the red states take them. And that's our deal, right? Like that's our national compact. The blue states, pay taxes, the red states take them. The red states say they don't want them, but they take them anyway. That is, like a lot of relationships, there's a rhetorical level and then there's a real level, but it's worked for a long time in a kind of messy way. I worry that that social compact will be in some way broken. Like if the Department of the Treasury is seen to be a place where you don't actually know where your money is going, it's a little unclear to me why the blue states are going to keep paying taxes. So that my prediction, my worst case is a little bit different than Lucan's. My worst case is that the union itself is split.
It's really interesting, just when we're going to the audience now, it's really interesting that Tim's optimistic case is friction and chaos because they are moving too quickly with overreaching objectives. And that's actually a good recipe for failure. Neither of you brought up the courts once.
Sorry?
Neither of you brought up the courts once in the discussion, which is interesting, right? Let's take, if you bring me some questions, we'll try to get to. We have, oh wow, it's a heavy pile here. Okay, here's the first one. Lucan, how do you see?
Do you have questions too? Oh, you're still
You're
right.
finishing writing, then they bring them up, and we'll try to do these rapid fire. Okay, how do you see the role of women and the whole issue of reproductive rights in these dynamics? Does that make a difference in the United States that you know?
Well, I think absolutely. I think gender was a huge part of the election, and that that was what got apparently, according to some data, a lot of African Americans to sit out the election, African American men. So I think that played a massive role. I mean, given how close the election was, I don't think that was the main reason, but I think that was, it definitely did not help the Democrats.
Yeah. It was tough. I mean,
yeah,
the Democrats lost 33 points on Hispanic men.
Yeah,
33 points. They did a lot worse on young men than they had to do. There may be various reasons for that. And of course, all that white women had to do was stay below 50%.
That's a really disturbing statistic which came out of that election that we all have to take on and think through about how we discuss these issues in a way. It's unfair that we do have to do that, but if we terrify male voters across racial categories, it's a very dangerous situation for women, frankly. And so it's nothing to do with fairness, but I'm just making a political point here that we have to do this. We have to do better than we've done in the past here. We just do. Okay, this is for Tim. Do you believe that we have passed the fundamental inflection point and that regime change is in process and that will outlast Trump? Or do you see this as surviving the 4 years with the open possibility of a restoration?
I think so. I want to answer that just by reframing the question. I don't believe that the United States was some kind of perfect democracy under the Biden administration. When I came into these debates about US democracy from, I mean, in a sense, like Luca and I have similar trajectories. Like I came into these debates about US democracy as somebody who had spent 20 years thinking about a very different part of the world. And when I came to the conferences in 2016, I was just sort of stunned by American political scientists and the way they tossed the word democracy around as though that was somehow a catch-all or obvious. Even then, I thought the debate was, is it oligarchy with democratic features or democracy with oligarchical features? So what I would say is that democracy is a possible American future. And we're not going to get to democracy by restoring the Biden administration or by restoring the Clinton administration or the Obama administration. This might lead, the contradictions of all of this, in my most optimistic view, lead to openings, ideological openings, in which people can make more radical arguments, and they lead to biographical openings in which some American politicians, Lucan gave some names, truly break through and show themselves in a light which a normal presidential competition doesn't allow.
So that's an argument for radically new ahead of us. Right? There's still grounds for optimism, but radically new.
That's how I see it.
Yeah. Lucan, it's right up your alley. how do you think the Trump-Musk coalition will influence other countries like Germany? Is this kind of oxygen into more radical authoritarianism in other countries?
I mean, I think it's a very dangerous coalition. I have a hard time imagining it's going to last for very long. I mean, I'm actually really interested in what you think about this, Tim. I mean, I find it, you just look at the pictures of Trump being kind of humiliated as Musk stands there, and he needs Musk, but it's like, how long? And this has only been a month, and you already see fissures. So I just, in a sense, I think, I'm more optimistic about this. I don't see it really surviving.
Okay, so I'm just going to quickly get a different view out there. And I think, so this is my view about Trump. Okay, my view about Trump is that he is a performative strongman, and that's the role he's most comfortable in. And of course, that's very bad and very dangerous, and it's consistent with all kinds of fascist things. Fascism is about performative masculinity, but I think in a weird way, he's actually comfortable being number two. So in the most successful part of his life, he was an actor, but he wasn't a scriptwriter. He wasn't a director. He was an actor reciting the lines that somebody else wrote, maybe with a little improvisation and so on. So I personally think that he's quite comfortable being number two, and that the relationship between Musk and Trump involves a certain sleight of hand in which Trump pretends to be number one, and Musk also pretends that he's number one. And I also think that this is one of the reasons why he's comfortable with Putin. In foreign affairs, I think he's comfortable with Putin being number one and being number two. So unlike Lucan, unlike a lot of colleagues, I actually think this relationship is, and I'd be very happy to be wrong, but I think it's fundamentally stable. Because I think it's a hierarchy that's been established with Trump as being number two. And I think we tend not to see Trump as number two because we're buying a little bit of the fascist presentation.
I mean, you don't actually think that Musk is number. I mean, Trump actually, he could fire Musk anytime you want. He is number. I mean, objectively, you may be the case, and you may be right that he is. I mean, I have no idea. Is comfortable with that, but he has the actual power.
Right. He also has the power to win the war in Ukraine. Right. Trump has the power to win the war in Ukraine. Like we have American policy instruments that we could use to win the war in Ukraine, but he's not going to do it because he's fundamentally submissive to Putin. I think it's, I mean, I could be wrong, but I think this is like, that's the equation. Yeah. I think he's comfortable being, you're right. He could. You're absolutely right that he could.
That's a really interesting, because I've always thought of it as a competition of narcissism, in which ultimately this relationship breaks apart. But you're saying something else is driving Trump.
I think Musk has much, I mean, I think apartheid at the scale of the solar system is a bigger ambition than Trump has. I think Trump wants to die in clean sheets in the White House with the Nobel Peace Prize on his neck. I think that's as far as it goes. Musk, I'm not sure exactly what Musk wants, but I think it's something much grander than that.
That's really worth thinking about, folks. This is for Tim. Was I last to Tim or last to you? Okay, Tim, this is you. To what extent can we look to the anti-intellectual and anti-expert movement that developed in the United States in the wake of COVID to account for this opening toward fascism?
I'm going to pass that one to Lucan. And I'll see if I think of anything.
Okay. I mean, I definitely think that sort of the rejection of experts is, a core part of the Trumpist ideology, Musk ideology. I mean, that is, central to the Republican project. So I absolutely think it's central. So, I don't know. Yes.
I mean, I think that so I have a very Arendtian view about this stuff, which is that I think isolation and loneliness is bad. And I think the double whammy of COVID plus social media was right-wing radicalizing. I'm not going to develop the whole argument here, but that's what so I think something slightly different. I mean, I think that's probably true. Yeah. But I think that the isolation was actually maybe more decisive.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably the most underestimated factor, the impact of COVID in all its dimensions.
Including everybody being angry all the time.
Yeah.
I get, okay, well, we can go in, I can take it in a very different direction, but I'll let you.
Yeah. So this one is for Tim,
Doesn't mean I'm going to take it.
No, you're gonna bump it off, that's for sure, that's for sure. This is a really, and you've already done this earlier today, so you can give a very short answer. What are the consequences of appeasing Russia? Which is what Trump is in the process of doing. You just mentioned he gave away 9 key negotiating points with Russia before the negotiation even started. And do you see this kind of thing as deeply undermining of US authority and US leadership in the world?
Yeah, I'll take that, but I also want to hear what Lucan has to say
Okay.
about that. So I think it's a little bit like what I said about domestic politics. I think all this is a little bit harder than they think, and that life is a little more unpredictable than they think, and you can't, like, in domestic politics, I think what they're up to is draining the state functionality from the system, and then imagining that they can rule, amidst a weaker state as stronger men. And I think that's also the model in international politics, where they think, okay, no, friendships, alliances, law, predictability, institutions, all of that, less important. We will rule as individual strong men in the system. But I think all of that actually makes the United States as a country much, much weaker than it was or than it has to be. And I think Trump's leverage with anybody, not just the Russians, but the Ukrainians, is seriously constrained by the choice not to use instruments of state power. I mean, he seems to be choosing not to use instruments of state power for anybody. And that, that means that we are actually, although we can send our guys to Saudi Arabia and we can use big words like peace, it's not clear how we actually get there. So of course, it's terrible for Ukraine that we're not going to actually do anything to help Ukraine, which we're not. There's not going to be military aid. There's not going to be civilian aid. There isn't going to be anything. When Trump says 350 billion, that's the fictional figure in his head of the amount of aid that we've already given. So best case is we don't disrupt it. And the stuff that, by the way, the Biden administration did yeoman's labor in the last few months. They really, really did without much notice of it. So the best case is that Trump people don't get in the way of that. I think the Ukraine is part of a larger issue, which is the attempt of the Americans to join the Russians in creating of a kind of what the Russians would call a multipolar order, in which laws, institutions, friendships, alliances, and so on matter a lot less. And strongman type regimes making deals is what really matters. That's a harder world for Ukraine, for sure. I don't think it's an impossible world for Ukraine. The Ukrainians have a great deal of sovereignty, and they have a great deal of ability to navigate difficult situations. And they also have the Europeans, some of whom have been activated by all this. But it's definitely a tougher, I think it's a funny thing is, I think that Trump doesn't actually care so much about Ukraine. He cares about, I think the whole thing about peace with Ukraine is a pretext to talk to Putin. I think it's just, he's standing on the backs of the Ukrainians in order to talk to Putin, which is what I think it's really all about for him.
So say something more there, Tim. Why does he want to talk to Putin so badly?
Because, well, he thinks that for him, that's real world, real power. He admires dictators, which I think does bear on the fascism discussion a little tiny bit. When you have strong men who admire other strong men, I think he's kind of a Mussolini. He's a Mussolini to Hitler type situation, right? There's clearly a hierarchy here, and Putin is on top. But also the other thing about this is I think they want to make deals with Russia. And again, this is a way that the Americans and the Russians now are a little bit alike, that they think that they're big countries that can do big deals involving raw materials and stuff like this. And he thinks of Russia as a big country with whom you can do deals. I think his whole life has kind of affirmed that. Russia has bailed him out at various points in his life. So I think he doesn't really care about Ukraine. He doesn't care about people dying, right? That's not it at all. It's just a way, it's an excuse for him to get to Russia. And my feeling is that at the end of the day, what's going to happen is there are going to be American-Russian deals, and the war in Ukraine is just going to keep going. And that, the thing that we keep expecting that I would love to be wrong about this, but the thing that we keep expecting, which is that somehow this American power is going to be leveraged to change the course of the war, I think that it's entirely possible that that's simply not going to happen at all. That all that's going to happen is a renewal of bilateral relations between the Americans and the Russians, which is bad for Ukraine, but which doesn't actually bear on the war in any direct way.
I agree, as you know. Lucan, what do you think?
So I mean, I think what is so bizarre. I mean, it's just the relationship between Trump and Russia is just so bizarre. Trump has all the objective power.
Yes.
He has vastly larger and more effective army. His country is vastly wealthier than Russia, yet he insists on being subordinate. Like, what the fuck is going on? We
edit that out in the transcript, okay?
But it is so just like weird, and all you can do is sort of like resort to some sort of psychological. I mean, it's just hard to know like what is going on. I mean, I don't know. I think it's going to be. I do want to say that I think we may look back and see Riyadh as being the inflection point. A world in which basically the axis of evil, essentially. United States, Russia, North Korea, sort of is you now have in the axis of evil, to adopt Bush W's term, is now has the world's largest military.
Can I jump in on there? Because this is so this kind of bears on the fascism discussion.
Yeah.
And I agree with Lucan that there is something. I mean, I wrote a whole book about this called Road to Unfreedom, where I was trying to use the Putin-Trump relationship as pars pro toto of the larger trend in world politics. But whatever you think it comes from, Trump's attitude towards Putin has been consistent for many years in a row. There have been, there have been like hopes that he'd be different, and there have been attempts to rebut the research findings of scholars and the Mueller report and so on. But if we look at it in a cold and sober way, he has just been submissive to Putin consistently for years and years in dramatic fashion. And this bears on fascism because it's about it's about the strength of the strong man being like personal charisma, as opposed to, going back to something Janice said earlier, as opposed to the state, right? Like, I think the relationship with fascists and the state is actually quite ambiguous, and that you don't have to in fact have a strong state. You just have to have a movement and a leader. But the other thing which is really important here is, and it bears on fascism, is the fascists of the 20s and 30s, whether it was the state or whether it was the party or the party state, which is, I think, their invention or their plagiarism of the Bolsheviks, the party state, not the party, not the state, but the party state. They were trying to amass power and crush others. It's not clear that Trump, Musk are trying to amass power and crush others. Yeah. On the contrary, it appears that if you look at the appointments, the purges, and the statements involving the American, what scholars of Eastern Europe like to call the power ministries. If you look at the statements, the civil servants, the new leaders, it looks much more like they're gearing up for civil war inside the United States. It looks much more like that. If you are seriously concerned about a 40-year confrontation with China, you do not put Pete Hegseth in charge of this Department of Defense, right? You don't put Tulsi Gabbard in charge of intelligence, right? You don't put those two guys in charge of the FBI, right? If you were seriously concerned about some kind of power struggle in the world, you just don't do things like that. And so the odd thing, in a way, I'm just like extending Lucan's point here, the odd thing is that they are making the United States objectively a hell of a lot weaker. I don't dare to curse the way that Lucan does, but I will venture a hell of a lot weaker than it has to be. And that could be actually a kind of fracturing point, because there are some people on the American right who have this old-fashioned view that the United States should be a strong country, right? And who don't actually want to see the United States submit consistently to lesser powers, which is what Trump is in fact doing.
Let me ask the two of you a question, which is perverse. So let's talk for a second about the alleged agreement that Trump has imposed on Ukraine. with respect to exploitation of Ukraine's critical minerals and resources, phony numbers, as you just said. But effectively, it makes the United States 100% owner for the foreseeable future into perpetuity of resources that that are Ukrainian resources. And there's an argument now, but it looks like Zelensky was on a version of this. So you could fit that, you don't need fascism here, you could fit that in, good old imperial colonialist exploitation, which is a familiar story in the 19th century, which fits with a story of Trump as a rapacious plunderer of near neighbors plus other vulnerable societies where he smells the weakness and he smells the dependence, applies to us, right, in Canada, and he smells the dependence that these societies have on him. There's another story here, though, and that's what I'm interested in. I want you to demolish this argument. To the extent that the United States acquired an important stake in the Ukrainian economy, and critical minerals really matter to the United States because it's a chip economy increasingly, and critical minerals are 87% now processed by China. The United States does not have secure access to the critical minerals that it needs. The extent it does, because it now has locked in Ukraine's resources, is that the stake which gets the Trump administration invested in Ukrainian sovereignty. Is that, in fact, it's a similar, it's an argument, and I just want to hear, there's an argument in Taiwan, which is longstanding, it's called the Silicon Shield. What protects Taiwan from invasion by China? It's the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company, which is the one in the world that gets the tiniest chips. Without them, China loses its capacity to produce high-level computers. It's not only the United States that loses, it's China loses, and therefore there's no interest ultimately in disrupting the supply chain that company needs, because it would be a catastrophe for both. Are we close to that in Ukraine, Tim? And Lucan?
I mean, the whole minerals deal is very hard to process. I mean, I was in Munich when the Americans made their second go at it. Their first go was in Kiev, the second go was in Munich. And what the Americans were essentially doing is saying, hand over control of your economy to us forever.
For nothing.
For nothing.
Yeah,
right?
for free.
For nothing.
Yeah. And
so it was like, I mean, in a way, Genesis, like it wasn't like 19th century colonialism, because at least the Belgians took the trouble of sending some people to the Congo.
Yeah.
Like
this is worse.
Right. Like they at least, I mean, well, worse, better, but at least like at least in Africa, the Europeans took the trouble to go and kill a lot of people, right? They took the trouble of arranging some kind of colonial order. And here it's just saying, you're a colonial people and somebody else has invaded you, therefore give us everything. So it's I think there's a lot to be said, as you suggest, about where the Americans are coming from here, like abstracting away from Ukraine and the war and the other circumstances. I think it reveals very clearly an attitude about the world, which is the world is a kind of thin crust, and there's stuff in that crust, and that stuff in that crust we need, and there's nothing else that really matters, which is startlingly close. And I realize I'm maybe beating a half a sleep horse at this point, if not a dead one, but that is a lot like chapter 2 of Mein Kampf. That the world is a thing, it's a finite amount of space and their resources, and anybody who thinks it's not a competition for those resources and who believes in law and stuff is just an idiot, right? So that, but then there's this also, I'm afraid, kind of cartoonish element to it, which is that when did Trump first hear about rare earths? Like when did that, and who brought his attention to it? And are the rare earths really so that we can get to Mars, or are the rare earths really just because Musk has them on his list of stuff for his terrible automobiles? And the rare earths that are in Ukraine, no one knows how easy or hard it will be to extract them. And almost all of them are in Donetsk, Luhansk, and Dnipro provinces. 2 of the 3 of which are largely or entirely Russian occupied, and the 3rd of which, if we let Russia win the war, Dnipro, I mean, knock on wood, but Dnipro would be one of the first, knock on wood, to go. So the whole thing is very hard to process, right?
Yeah.
But I don't, I have a hard time thinking that has anything to do with the long-term interests of the American state. My main take on this, I'm just going to repeat what I said before. We are, all of these things we could get, right? That's my American we. Like whatever's in Greenland, whatever's in Ukraine,
Whatever's in Canada.
whatever's in Canada, I wasn't gonna, you know, I was leaving that to you. But you know, whatever it is, like we could have been nice and we could have gotten it. And instead, we're choosing the route which is most likely to intimidate, not intimidate, most likely to alienate, and over the long run, make it unlikely that we'll get this stuff, right? Because if you're a Ukrainian now, you know, with apologies to the Ukrainians I see in front of me in the room, but if you're a Ukrainian now, like how has your, don't answer this question actually, because I have tender feelings, but you know, how has your attitude towards the United States changed in the last few days, right? And how many years of good faith and effort and will does it ever take to get that back? And we've done the same thing with the Europeans. We've done the same thing with the Canadians. So I don't think this binds us to Ukraine. I think in a month, he may well have forgotten that this ever happened. I think the Ukrainians are probably wiser, the government, I mean, wiser and more resourceful in dealing with this particular problem than we would be in the same situation. I think they see it as something that has to be managed, and I think they're doing their best to manage it.
So a couple things. One, this reminds me, when I was working for the World Bank in Donetsk in the 1990s, I was a young.
You were young?
Yeah, I was young, believe it or not.
Once you were?
Once I was young, far less gray hair. And my first job was to, we were working on closing coal mines and with social benefits. So I was supposed to negotiate with the deputy mayor of Donetsk. And I spent a long time on the Russian translation and worked these things out. And I was like, came into the office and I nervously gave him, I said, what do you think? He says, da, pожалуйста. And he signed it. I was like, wow, I'm an incredible negotiator. And I feel like this is like that deputy mayor is like Zelensky. He's like, he knows that it's never going to be fulfilled, like whatever. You know, I mean, that basically he rightly understands that, you know, Trump is mercurial, that, you know, that you just say yes and then have no intention of following through because you know that, you know, about 95% chance that he will kind of move on to the next shiny thing. I guess, so maybe I'm being, okay, so maybe I'm being intensely naive, but I do kind of wonder, and this brings me to a larger point, you know, this new kind of imperialism, right? This is, you know, strikingly different from the, you know, Trump one, right? This is, we used to think, oh, you know, Trump was just, you know, inward focus. He wasn't into military conquest. He's been talking, you know, a lot about the 51st state. But I'm not sure whether this is simply trolling as opposed to a genuine desire to kind of build. My wife is shaking her head. She thinks it's not. I mean,
I agree. It's not.
You know, okay. All I can say is he has yet to invest serious of his, you know, resources into the imperial project. So I say at bare minimum, it's
well, that's Tim's point.
But the thing,
right?
the thing about Ukraine is that he's using the Russian army. Like that's the dastardly thing about you is that, you know, we're using the Russian army.
Yeah.
We're not using our own army. We're using the army that's already in Ukraine to exercise the pressure. And so it's a weird. So it's like it's more. I mean, these analogies all have their limitations and caveats, but it's more of a Molotov-Ribbentrop situation than it is a Munich 1938 situation. We're cooperating with the Russians. We're using the threat of Russian violence to exert pressure on Ukraine, and I think like that is consistent with the view that the U.S. is, which is my view. Like I think he means it. Like if I were Canada, you know, I would be like, oh yes, United States, that's a very good idea about border control, you know, and I would be using that as a pretext to do all kinds of interesting things at your border, right? But you know, drones are very helpful at the border. You're right, Mr. Trump. It's like good to have a lot of drones at the border. Good point. I mean, I would be doing these things if I were Canada. But there is a difference between having this kind of, you know, using somebody else's army to enforce a colonial expectation and using your own army. And I'm not sure that my strong intuition is that we don't have it together enough to invade Panama let alone Denmark or you guys. I don't think it's a lack of will. I think it's a lack of way at this point. I think what we are setting ourselves up for is intra-institutional and inter-institutional and intra-societal conflict with an extra dose of we'll take your stuff if we can get it. But the ability to get it, I mean, I think in Ukraine is in a way a special case, right? Because it's not like if the Russian army were in 23% of Canada, then we could say, oh yeah, you know, our Russian allies, they might also take Alberta if you don't give us your timber or whatever, right? But that's not the, no, I mean, that is what happened to Ukraine. I mean, that is one of the reasons, there are 10 reasons, you know, there's so many reasons why this is awful, what we did, and shameful and unforgettably shameful. But one of them is that we are leveraging the violence of the Russian armed forces in order to do this. And the Russian armed forces are not in Canada, so we can't leverage them against you.
Right.
Well, the only thing I can say on that note is, thank goodness the Russian army is not here. I agree with Zareen. They're actually serious from everything we know. Anybody who's had contact with the US decision makers who are talking about this is now persuaded that they're serious, and we have to take it seriously rather than consider it trolling, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, we have to take it seriously, but, you know, I mean, as Tim said, Hexeth, I mean, like, I mean, he's not.
You don't need military force to actually accomplish the objectives, because it turns into some kind of play of the kind that we're just seeing, which is extortionate demands, which we acquiesce to in order to limit the economic damage. So that's why what's happening in Ukraine is so tragic, so awful, but unfortunately so relevant to the way we think about it.
Yeah, I think,
So first of all, I want to say thank you to Lucan and Timothy.
She's telling us not to talk anymore.
That's right, because there's wine out there, all right? I cannot stand between you two and wine. This was really superb, and virtue is always its own punishment. We're watching history, in a sense, being made in front of our eyes. I'm going to get you two together. It is now February. I'm going to get you two together probably in June, but the latest September, to reprise what we're doing now. And we're going to kind of monitor where the two of you are as you look at this and see how your intellectual frameworks are evolving, because this is sadly not going away. And for Canadians, this is probably the most existential moment we've had in our modern history. So this is not an academic discussion only. So thank you both. This was really great.
Thanks, Lucan.
Thanks.
Thank you, Tim.